Hi, I'm B. Moorhead. I'm the Executive Director of Texas Impact, and I'm here with my friend and policy colleague, Dylan Lay, our policy fellow, and we are at the climate negotiations in Belém. And we've just been to our first side event of this year's COP with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees and a panel of extraordinary speakers talking about the refugee experience with respect to climate. So Dylan, what'd you think about your first side event?
I loved it. I thought it was amazing. I was telling you myself, it can be a little deceptive coming out of that, so sure of the hope that we could have, because there's so many people from so many different parts of the world that are so committed to working together on this issue. But at the same time, it's a reminder that we have to get out and expand the work that we've done across the world to people within our own communities.
Yeah, I would say there was a theme that stories of people whose lived experiences of climate-induced migration are one of the ways that we're going to need to help explain to people that climate change is real and that it's really impacting human existence. Maybe the most compelling thing anyone said was someone asked, what gives you hope? And one of the spokespeople on the panel said, I didn't come to the COP for hope. I came for action. And stories like these refugees' stories are what's going to provoke action. So we heard three really kind of different stories from three different refugees, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the interesting part about the panel is that it highlights the diverse nature of what it means to be a climate refugee. We might have a more constricted idea of someone that goes from one giant natural disaster from country to country, but there's different types of migration. There's eternal migration. We had an individual that was from Brazil and migrated within their own country because of climate disaster. We also had an indigenous woman that was talking about how she had to go from Venezuela to Brazil. And we also have migration from South Sudan to Uganda, and the policy that comes as a result of that migration. We know one of the highlights for me was that in Uganda, they are finally allowing, unlike lots of other countries in how they approach policy, refugees to have a say and a seat at the table when it comes to policy.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big takeaways, I think, over and over was the people who are experiencing climate-induced migration need to be part of the conversation about the way countries are handling adaptation and migration. And one of the interesting comments was that climate migration doesn't constitute a failure of adaptation. It is a form of adaptation. That's exactly right. And just the idea that if you can't stay here, you're gonna have to go somewhere else, and that's a perfectly rational choice. I was really impressed that the country of Uganda is taking such a forward-thinking approach to incorporating refugees into their official national climate planning process. And that was something that we heard over and over, was that it's not just a question of humanitarian aid and, what can we do for the poor refugees? It was, they need to be part of the policy solution. And in fact, the woman who was internally displaced in Brazil is working on legislation in Brazil right now. So I thought that was very cool.
Yeah.
What did you think about that general idea of the people who are the most impacted have some special knowledge? Do you think that that's right?
Yeah, I thought that was something that stood out to me a lot when we were talking about the indigenous displacement and the migration that comes as a result. The woman from Venezuela mentioned that, we already know, us as indigenous people, how to take care of nature. We are the people that, are most in touch with nature itself. They don't have this modern conception of, human beings being separated from nature, and
Right.
yet they're not being listened to when it comes to implementation of how we were talking about, environmental policy, where we're thinking about these things as completely separate. And so that really did stand out to me, I would say.
What did you think about the audience questions? I thought that was kind of a mixed bag.
There were some interesting questions in terms of how we can be approaching the framework legally. I mean, there were some questions regarding certain events or certain cases that should be thought of or pointed out more specifically. But I also think that climate change is kind of its own whole. It's difficult to address so many things at once when a lot of it is a connected problem. One thing in terms of the legal framework is that we need to be thinking about how we're going to address people that have to deal with climate migration, but are not necessarily part of these headlining disasters.
Exactly.
Step by step of, the sea line increasing on my house instead of a hurricane blowing down my neighborhood.
Right. It's what we call slow onset disasters as opposed to quick onset disasters. So it's easy to see, when the mountain caves in or the hurricane happens, clearly people are going to be displaced. It's harder to attribute every year it gets a little bit worse. And so one of the things that came up a lot was the idea of finance, and finance not just for those disasters that happen all in one go, but how adaptation finance needs to go to the places that need it,
Exactly.
not the places that it's easy to send it.
Of course, climate finance is going to be at the heart of many of our focuses, right? But it's not just climate finance. It's having the money and knowing where to direct it. Because if we're thinking, like you mentioned, in this overly simplistic way of the only places that need that finance are those that are hit by these giant disasters, we're going to be missing the people that we're losing day by day.
Exactly. The last point I think that I would want to make is there were several questions that kind of were in the framework of, well, there's all kinds of reasons for migration. Climate isn't the only one. And shouldn't we be talking about all migration holistically? So two things about that. First of all, actually, there's no legal framework to talk about climate migration as its own thing right now. And in fact, American faith communities have been petitioning the American government for several years to advocate for climate-induced migration as a separate refugee category. We haven't made progress on that so far. But I thought the High Commissioner made a really good point that, yes, there are all kinds of different injustices. He said, no human displacement happens without injustice.
That's right.
And so it's always at the root injustice that drives migration, forced migration displacement. He said, why don't we start with climate? And I think that's going to be a common theme this year and probably going forward, not just with respect to migration, but that, there's a lot of problems in the world and it's easy to see that they are all intersectional. When we're in this space, we're here to talk about it in a climate framework. Well, we'll do it again tomorrow.
Yes, we will. Stay tuned.